I woke up to the sound of children laughing and splashing outside. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I don't have kids. I don't even have guests over. My house is my sanctuary, quiet, peaceful, and most importantly, mine. But as I stumbled out of bed, threw on a t-shirt, and peeked out the window, my brain short-circuited. My pool, my private pool, was filled with people. Strangers. Kids, moms, an instructor with a whistle around his neck, all treating it like their personal community center. And at the center of it all, standing with a smug expression like a queen overseeing her kingdom, was Karen. My stomach twisted into a knot of rage and disbelief. Karen, the HOA dictator, the woman who lived to make my life miserable, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood morality. The same woman who once fined me for leaving my trash can out for an extra 15 minutes past pickup. And here she was, using my property like she owned it. I stormed outside, still groggy but fueled by righteous anger. What the hell is going on? I shouted, making every head in the pool turn toward me. The instructor looked confused. The kids just kept splashing. And Karen? Karen had the audacity to sip her iced coffee and smirk at me. "Oh, good morning, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" My hands clenched into fists. "Why are there people in my pool?" She raised an eyebrow, as if I was the one being ridiculous. "I sent out a notice last week. We decided your pool would be a wonderful addition to the community. Since so many families need swim lessons, and you never seem to use it, I thought it would be a generous gesture to open it up." I blinked. My brain struggled to process the level of insanity I was dealing with. "We? Who's we?" Karen gestured vaguely at the air. "The HOA, of course." I stared at her. "The HOA doesn't own my pool. I own my pool." "Well, technically," she said, tilting her head, "HOA guidelines state that community resources should be shared, and since your backyard is large enough and accessible." I cut her off. "It's not a community resource. It's private property." She waved a hand dismissively. "Jake, don't be selfish. It's just a pool." My blood pressure skyrocketed. "It's just my pool." The instructor looked uncomfortable. I wasn't aware this wasn't approved by the homeowner. Should we, wrap this up?" Karen shot him a glare. "Nonsense. We have 3 more sessions today. Jake, if you'd like to observe, I'd be happy to offer you a discount on lessons." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're charging people?" She gave me a patronizing look. "Well, I am organizing everything. And these families need help." I laughed. A short, bitter laugh. "So let me get this straight. You illegally use my pool for swim lessons I never approved, and you're making money off of it." "Don't be so dramatic," she scoffed. "It's for the good of the community." At that moment, I wanted to do something drastic. Drain the pool. Install an electric fence. Maybe fill it with piranhas. Instead, I took the slightly less insane approach. "Everyone out," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "You heard me," I said, louder this time. "Everyone out. Right now. Swim time's over." Parents exchanged nervous glances. The instructor grabbed his towel and started ushering the kids out. Karen, however, stood her ground, arms crossed over her chest. "You can't just kick them out," she said, her voice now laced with irritation. "Watch me," I said, stepping closer. "I'm calling the cops if you don't clear out in the next 5 minutes." Her face twitched for a second before she forced another condescending smile. "There's no need for that, Jake. You're being unreasonable." I pulled out my phone. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. That did it. She turned on her heel, plastering on a fake smile for the parents. "All right, everyone. That's enough for today. Let's pack up." The pool slowly emptied, kids shivering from the abrupt exit, parents muttering apologies. The instructor gave me a nod before disappearing. Karen lingered. She took one last sip of her coffee and shook her head at me, as if I was some misbehaving child. "You could have handled that better," she said. I gritted my teeth. "Stay off my property." She sighed dramatically. "Fine. But just so you know, the HOA will be discussing this. There may be consequences." I folded my arms. "Oh, I'm sure there will be." She smirked and walked off, leaving wet footprints across my patio. As I watched her leave, I had an uneasy feeling. This wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to take no as an answer. And sure enough, the very next morning, a fresh HOA violation letter was waiting in my mailbox. Apparently, my fence was suddenly the wrong color. The next morning, as I stepped outside to get my mail, I was greeted by an unpleasant sight: an HOA violation letter taped directly onto my mailbox. That alone told me exactly who was behind it. Normal HOA notices were delivered in envelopes, but this? This had Karen's petty fingerprints all over it. I ripped it off, scanned the contents, and immediately felt my blood pressure spike. Apparently, my fence was suddenly not the correct shade of beige. The exact wording stated that homeowners must comply with the standardized color palette to ensure neighborhood uniformity. Which was funny, because my fence had been the same color since the day I moved in. And it was the same shade as my neighbor's fence. But of course I knew what this was. I crumpled the letter in my fist and turned to look down the street. And there she was, Karen, standing in her yard, watering her plants with the smuggest grin I had ever seen. She knew I saw her. She knew what she had done. And she was waiting, just waiting for me to react. I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and waved. She blinked, as if caught off guard by my lack of rage. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, I walked back inside, sat down at my laptop, and started digging through the HOA bylaws. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. By lunchtime, another letter had arrived. This one claimed that my grass was half an inch too long. I wasn't even sure how that was measured, but I knew for a fact that my lawn was trimmed to the same height it had always been. My neighbor, who had slightly longer grass, wasn't cited. That was when it became clear. Karen was going to try and bury me in bogus HOA violations. She wanted to push me to the breaking point, either until I gave in or I moved out. I wasn't going anywhere. The final straw came that evening when I got home from running errands and found a bright orange warning notice stuck to my door. According to this new piece of nonsense, my mailbox was suddenly not in compliance with HOA regulations. This was the same mailbox that had been here for years, the same one the previous owner had installed, and the same one that had passed multiple HOA inspections. Karen wasn't even trying to be subtle. I stormed over to her house and knocked on her door, harder than necessary. She took her time answering, but when she did, she gave me that fake, polite smile that made my skin crawl. "Jake, how lovely to see you. How can I help you?" I held up the notice. "What the hell is this?" Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, an HOA compliance notice. Nothing personal, just ensuring our community stays beautiful." I narrowed my eyes. "My mailbox has been fine for years." She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Really? Well, a few of the board members have been reviewing community standards, and we realize some homeowners have been, shall we say, a little lax in maintaining their properties. I'm sure it was just an oversight on your part." I clenched my jaw. "And what about my grass? My fence? Funny how I'm the only one suddenly out of compliance." Karen sighed, as if I was being exhausting. "Jake, if you just followed the rules, we wouldn't have this issue." I took a step closer. "Cut the crap, Karen. This is about the pool, isn't it?" She smiled wider. "I don't know what you mean." I exhaled through my nose, willing myself not to say something that would get me fined for disturbing the peace. Instead, I turned and walked away. Arguing with Karen was like arguing with a brick wall, except the wall was somehow more reasonable. But I wasn't going to let her win. I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. I took pictures of my fence, my lawn, my mailbox, and I even got a professional landscaper to measure my grass. Because if she wanted to play dirty, I was going to fight back with cold, hard facts. Then I attended the next HOA meeting. Karen sat at the head of the table, wearing her signature smug expression, surrounded by a handful of board members who were either her loyal followers or too afraid to challenge her. As soon as I walked in, I noticed a few of my neighbors giving me sympathetic looks. Clearly, I wasn't the only one Karen had been targeting. The meeting started with the usual nonsense: budget reports, upcoming events, a discussion about parking regulations. I waited patiently until the floor was opened for homeowner concerns. I raised my hand. "I'd like to address something." Karen barely hid her smirk. "Go ahead, Jake." I stood up, holding up a thick folder of documents. I have been issued multiple HOA violations over the past 3 days. Every single one of them is either incorrect, selectively enforced, or completely fabricated. Karen's expression didn't change, but I saw the way one of the board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. First, my fence. According to this notice, my fence is not in compliance with the HOA's standardized color palette. However, I have photographic proof that my fence is the same color as my neighbor's, who has not received a violation. Karen interjected. "Jake, We're not here to single anyone out. I held up a hand. I'm not finished. I pulled out another document. Next, my grass. I hired a professional landscaper to measure it. According to their report, my lawn is trimmed exactly to HOA specifications. Yet, I was cited for excessive length. Again, my neighbor, whose grass is visibly longer, received no citation. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's smile was beginning to look a little forced. And finally, I said, slapping down the last paper, my mailbox. This is a copy of the HOA's own regulations, which clearly state my mailbox meets compliance. Yet, I received a notice anyway. Karen's fingers tapped against the table. Jake, perhaps if you had come to us earlier, we could have discussed. I cut her off. No, Karen. This isn't about compliance. This is about retaliation. You used my pool without permission, made money off of it, and when I told you no, you decided to harass me with bogus violations. The murmurs grew louder. Some of the board members looked uneasy. One of them, a man I barely knew but who always seemed reasonable, spoke up. Karen, is this true? She scoffed. Of course not. Jake is simply misinterpreting routine enforcement. I exhaled sharply. Then let's vote on it. Right now. If the board truly believes my violations are legitimate, I'll comply. But if even one of them agrees that these are unfair, they need to be removed. Karen's eyes flickered with something. Panic? Frustration? For the first time, she didn't seem completely in control. Another board member hesitated. I think we should review the notices. I fought the urge to smile. The tide was turning. Karen cleared her throat. Fine. We'll review them. But that doesn't change the fact that the HOA has authority over neighborhood policies. I met her gaze, unwavering. And it doesn't change the fact that you illegally used my pool for profit. This isn't over, Karen. She smiled, but this time, it didn't reach her eyes. No, it isn't. I walked out of that meeting knowing one thing for certain. She was going to come back even harder. And I was ready for it. I knew Karen wasn't going to back down. That meeting may have put a dent in her confidence, but if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she never took a loss lightly. She had the stubbornness of a mosquito, small, annoying, and impossible to ignore. I needed to be ready for whatever she planned next. But this time, I wasn't going to play defense. If she wanted a war, I was going to make sure she regretted ever stepping onto the battlefield. The idea hit me late at night, while I was sitting by the pool, staring at the water and thinking about how much Karen had made my life miserable. Every ridiculous HOA notice, every smug smirk, every time she made me want to throw something. Then I remembered the look on her face when I had kicked everyone out of the pool. The frustration, the anger, the desperation. She had banked on using my pool for her scam, and I had shut her down. But that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure that even if she tried again, it would blow up in her face. And that was when the idea hit me. If Karen wanted to use my pool, I was going to make sure it was the absolute worst experience of her life. The next morning, I made a few calls. First, I contacted a local supplier that dealt with bulk ice deliveries. When I explained what I needed, the guy on the other end actually laughed before confirming the order. Then I went to a hardware store and picked up a few tools to disable my pool heater. It wasn't enough to just fill the pool with ice. I needed to make sure it stayed freezing. By the afternoon, everything was in motion. A massive truck pulled up to my driveway, and the driver gave me a knowing grin as he unloaded bag after bag of ice. My neighbors must have thought I had lost my mind. I didn't care. I spent the next hour dumping ice into the pool, watching as the water turned a shade of icy blue. Then I adjusted the settings on the heater, ensuring that it wouldn't kick in even if someone tried to tamper with it. By the time I was done, the water temperature had plummeted to near Arctic levels. No normal person would willingly jump in. But Karen? She was so arrogant, so convinced of her own superiority, that she wouldn't even consider that I had set a trap. She would walk right into it. And she did. The very next morning, I was woken up by the sound of laughter and splashing. Again, the audacity was almost impressive. Karen had actually brought another group of people over, fully expecting that I would be too exhausted to fight her off again. I grabbed my phone, walked outside, and prepared to enjoy the show. At first, nobody noticed anything was wrong. A few of the kids stood at the edge of the pool, dipping their toes in and hesitating. The instructor, different from the last one, seemed a little confused as well. But Karen, ever the fearless leader, marched right up to the edge of the pool, her whistle swinging around her neck, and gave an exaggerated clap of her hands. "All right, everyone," she called. "Let's get started. No time to waste." And then, without hesitation, she jumped in. The scream that came out of her was the kind of sound you only hear in horror movies. It was instant. The second she hit the water, her body reacted violently to the shock of the freezing temperature. She flailed, her arms splashing wildly as she tried to push herself back up. But the shock had robbed her of her coordination, and for a terrifying second, it looked like she might actually go under. The instructor and a few parents rushed forward, panicking, but Karen managed to scramble her way to the pool's edge, her entire body shaking like a leaf in the wind. She clawed at the tiles, dragging herself out of the water like some kind of frozen swamp creature. Her skin was covered in goosebumps, her hair dripping, her eyes wide with shock and fury. She looked like she had just been dragged out of the Arctic Ocean. "What the hell?" she shrieked, wrapping her arms around herself as she shivered violently. I leaned against the patio railing, casually sipping my coffee. "Oh, good morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Her head snapped toward me, her teeth chattering as she struggled to form words. What did you do?" I shrugged. "Oh, I just decided to cool things down a little. Make my pool more refreshing." One of the parents, who had been holding her child back from jumping in, looked at Karen with a frown. "You didn't check the water temperature before inviting us here?" Karen let out a high-pitched, awkward laugh. "Well, it's usually fine, The instructor, now looking incredibly annoyed, grabbed his towel and muttered, "I'm not dealing with this," before walking off. The parents quickly followed, gathering their kids and shooting Karen looks of distrust. I could practically see her crumbling inside. Her reputation, her little scam, everything she had built was falling apart in front of her eyes. "You're insane," she hissed at me, her face now turning red from rage rather than cold. I smiled. "No, Karen. I'm just tired of your crap." She stomped her foot, her wet shoes making a ridiculous squelching sound that made me want to laugh. "This isn't over." I took a sip of my coffee. "Oh, I hope not. I'm having way too much fun." She stormed off, dripping wet and humiliated, leaving behind the icy disaster she had walked straight into. But I wasn't done. After she left, I pulled out my phone and sent the footage to a few key places. First, to my lawyer, who had already been helping me prepare a case against her for unauthorized use of my property. Second, to the HOA board, who were already starting to turn against her after our last meeting. And third, well, let's just say social media has a way of making sure justice is served. By the time evening rolled around, I had already received multiple messages from neighbors, all laughing at the video of Karen's frozen tantrum. Some of them had even started calling her Arctic Karen. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to take humiliation lying down. She was going to strike back. And I needed to be ready. So I sat back, stretched my legs, and started planning my next move. If she thought this was a battle, she hadn't seen anything yet. I knew Karen wouldn't take the humiliation lightly. After the freezing pool incident, she had stormed off like a wet cat, but that wasn't the end of it. No, Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control, and now that she had lost it, she was going to do whatever it took to get it back. I wasn't sure what form her retaliation would take, but I knew it was coming. And sure enough, it did, faster than I expected. The first sign of trouble arrived the very next morning. I opened my mailbox to find a large, official-looking envelope. It was from a law firm. For a split second, my stomach twisted in anxiety, but then I reminded myself who I was dealing with. I tore it open and read the first few lines. Cease and desist. I almost laughed. The letter claimed that I had sabotaged an HOA event, endangered community members, and engaged in harassment of an HOA representative. It went on to demand that I cease all hostile actions against the HOA and its president or risk legal consequences. The best part, it was signed by Karen herself, not an actual lawyer. I couldn't help but grin. This was her big move? A fake legal threat? I walked back inside, sat down at my laptop, and did a quick search on the law firm listed on the letterhead. It didn't exist. Classic Karen. She had literally made up a legal threat, thinking I'd back down. I decided to have some fun with it. A few minutes later, I typed up a short, professional-sounding email and sent it to the HOA board. I attached the letter and asked for clarification on why an HOA dispute was being handled by what appeared to be a non-existent law firm. I CC'd a real lawyer friend of mine, just for effect. Then I sat back and waited. By noon, the HOA group chat was on fire. Apparently, Other members of the board had no idea Karen had sent a cease and desist letter, let alone a fraudulent one. The legal consequences of forging a law firm's letterhead were serious, and it didn't take long for the panic to set in. By the afternoon, one of the more reasonable board members called me. He sounded nervous. "Jake, listen, there's been some miscommunication. Karen, may have overstepped her authority. We're going to have an emergency meeting about this." I smirked. "Great. I'll be there." I knew what was happening. The HOA board, after seeing Karen make a fool of herself with the pool stunt, was starting to realize that she was a liability. They had been willing to let her antics slide when she was just making up nonsense rules, but outright fraud? That was harder to ignore. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was pure chaos. Karen sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, her face red with frustration. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't about to go down without a fight. One of the board members, an older woman named Linda, cleared her throat. "Karen, we received a copy of the cease and desist letter you sent to Jake. Can you explain why you took legal action on behalf of the HOA without consulting the board?" Karen sat up straighter. "I did what was necessary to protect the community from harassment." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "So just to be clear, you believe that filling my own pool with ice to prevent unauthorized use is harassment?" Karen shot me a glare. "You were deliberately obstructing a community activity." Another board member, a middle-aged guy named Steve, shook his head. "Karen, this wasn't a community activity. You were charging people. This was a business. And you used HOA funds for it, didn't you?" For the first time, Karen hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Steve turned to the treasurer, a quiet, no-nonsense man who rarely spoke during meetings. "Dan, have there been any unusual withdrawals from HOA funds recently?" Dan nodded and flipped through a few papers. "Yes, a few large withdrawals under community enrichment programs. The descriptions are vague, but they correspond with the dates of Karen's swim lessons." Karen's face went pale. Steve sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Karen, did you use HOA funds to rent instructors and buy supplies for your private business?" Karen opened and closed her mouth. "It was for the community," she muttered. Linda scoffed. "Oh, please. If it was for the community, why were you charging people?" Silence. I watched as the realization sank in for the rest of the board. Karen hadn't just overstepped her authority. She had embezzled HOA funds for personal gain. That was a serious offense, one that could get her into legal trouble. The meeting ended with a unanimous decision. Karen was removed from the HOA presidency, effective immediately. But even as they voted, she sat there, stiff, her nails digging into the table, her rage barely contained. I could see it in her eyes, she wasn't done. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find my pool trashed. Someone had thrown bags of lawn clippings, garbage, and dye into the water, turning it into a disgusting green sludge. The filter was clogged with debris, and the entire area reeked of chemicals. I didn't need to check the security cameras to know who had done it, but I checked them anyway. And there she was. At 2:37 a.m., Karen had snuck into my yard, carrying garbage bags and buckets of what looked like cleaning chemicals. She had taken her time, methodically ruining my pool, as if she was performing some kind of ritualistic revenge act. I smiled. This was exactly what I needed. By noon, the police were at Karen's door. I didn't go over. I just stood at my own property and watched as 2 officers knocked, waited, and eventually led her outside. She was still in her bathrobe, her hair a mess, clearly having not expected this to happen so fast. She argued with them, waving her arms dramatically, but the officers weren't having it. A few minutes later, she was in the back of a patrol car, being driven away. Neighbors gathered, whispering, watching the spectacle unfold. One of them, a guy named Mark, walked over and clapped me on the shoulder. "Damn, Jake. I don't know what you did, but that was beautiful." I shrugged, sipping my coffee. Just letting karma do its thing. Karen was charged with trespassing, vandalism, and HOA fund misuse. She was facing hefty fines and possible legal action from the board. But the best part? She was forced to sell her house to pay off the legal fees. A few weeks later, she was gone. The neighborhood felt lighter without her presence. The new HOA president was actually reasonable, and I finally got to enjoy my pool in peace. No more bogus violations. No more ridiculous rules. No more Karen. And as I sat by my newly cleaned, properly heated pool, I smiled to myself, watching the water ripple under the setting sun. Victory had never felt so refreshing. The neighborhood had never felt so peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could walk outside without the fear of a ridiculous HOA violation notice taped to my door. There were no more surprise pool invasions, no more fake legal threats, and best of all, no more Karen. Her house had been listed for sale just a week after her arrest, and within days, a new family had moved in. The best part? They were nothing like her. Quiet, friendly, and most importantly, they had no interest in running a community dictatorship. For the first time in a long time, I could actually enjoy my mornings. I sat by my freshly cleaned, properly heated pool, sipping my coffee, enjoying the calm. But even as I relaxed, there was a small part of me that remained skeptical. Karen had been forced to sell her house, her reputation had been ruined, and the HOA had completely turned against her. That should have been the end of it. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. That feeling turned out to be right. 2 weeks after she had supposedly disappeared from the neighborhood for good, I was woken up at midnight by the sound of my doorbell ringing. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then it rang again. And again. Sharp, impatient presses, like someone was demanding to be let in. I groaned, throwing off my blanket and stumbling toward the door. My security cameras were already recording, so I pulled up the footage on my phone before opening anything. What I saw made my stomach drop. Karen, standing outside my house in the dead of night, wearing a hoodie, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and desperation. I stared at the screen, half expecting it to be some kind of hallucination. But there she was, pacing on my porch, muttering to herself, reaching up to ring the bell again. I wasn't about to open the door. Instead, I flipped on the porch light and spoke through the intercom. Karen, what the hell are you doing here? She froze, her head snapping toward the camera, her expression twisting into something that was both unhinged and determined. Jake, she said, her voice shaky but firm. You need to fix this. I frowned. Fix what? She let out a frustrated breath. You ruined my life. My house, my position, everything. I have nothing left, Jake. And it's all because of you. I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. Karen, you did that to yourself. You trespassed. You stole from the HOA. You vandalized my property. She shook her head violently. No. You set me up. You humiliated me. You tricked me into the pool. You manipulated the board. You turned everyone against me. I stared at her through the screen, dumbfounded. Karen, you made those choices. You could have just left me alone. But no, you had to push and push and push until you got caught. She stepped closer to the camera, her face inches from the lens. You don't get it. I had power. I had respect. People listened to me. And now I'm just a joke. I sighed. Not my problem. She banged her fist against the door. It is your problem. You need to help me fix this. I want my house back. I want my position back. You need to tell everyone that this was all a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. Oh, yeah, sure, let me just walk into the HOA meeting and say, hey guys, actually Karen didn't steal from you, and she didn't vandalize my pool. Let's all just forget the security footage and the financial records, okay? Her jaw clenched. I'll make your life miserable if you don't. I scoffed. Oh, really? How? You don't even live here anymore. She inhaled sharply, her shoulders trembling. I'll find a way. I was done. I had wasted enough of my time dealing with her nonsense. Without another word, I ended the intercom call and dialed the police. Karen stood on my porch for another few minutes, staring at the camera, breathing heavily. Then, as if she realized I wasn't going to let her in, she turned and walked away. The police arrived 10 minutes later. I showed them the footage, told them about the ongoing harassment, and they took a report. Apparently, Karen had been staying in a cheap motel a few miles away, too ashamed to show her face anywhere near her old social circle. The officers said they'd look into it, but I already knew what was going to happen. Karen was like a cockroach. She'd scurry off for a while, but she'd be back. Except this time, I was prepared. I upgraded my security system, reinforced my fence, installed motion-activated lights around the property. If Karen wanted to keep coming back, I was going to make sure she never got past the front yard. For the next few weeks, I kept my guard up, but nothing happened. No more surprise visits, no more threats, no more Karen. It was like she had finally realized she had lost. And then one day, I got a message from an unknown number. You may have won this battle, but I will never forget what you did. I stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the message and blocking the number. It was over. Karen had been defeated. Life went back to normal. The HOA actually started doing what it was supposed to, keeping the neighborhood running smoothly without unnecessary interference. The new president, Linda, made it clear that the days of tyrannical rule were over. People could actually enjoy their homes again. And me? I finally got to enjoy my pool in peace. One afternoon, as I lounged in the sun, a few of my neighbors stopped by. Mark, the guy who had laughed when Karen got arrested, handed me a beer. Man, I still can't believe you took her down. It's like watching a villain get their final comeuppance. I smirked, taking a sip. She had it coming. Linda sat down in a chair beside me. I have to admit, I wasn't sure you were going to win at first. Karen had a way of making people think she was untouchable. I nodded, looking out at the pool, the water rippling gently in the breeze. Everyone's untouchable until they meet the right person willing to push back. She laughed. Well, here's to you, Jake. The guy who finally put an end to the reign of HOA Karen. The group raised their drinks, clinking bottles together in a small but satisfying victory toast. And as I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, my home was mine again. No more HOA tyranny. No more ridiculous fines. No more Karen. Just peace, quiet, and the sweet, sweet satisfaction of knowing that I had won.